Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another parent class here from Tumwater School District tonight with Candyce Bollinger. We're going to do the topic of the class is overindulgence. Like always, these classes are recorded and posted to our website. We just ask that while we're having our class that we don't have you record on your own phone. But since we kind of have a lower amount of people attending this evening, we would just like to really open it up, kind of like have an open discussion, kind of round table about what Candyce is going to bring us this evening. So without further ado, Miss Candyce, away you go.
All right. So as she said, you're absolutely fine, you guys, just to leave yourselves open so you can just spontaneously ask questions or make comments or whatever. So please feel free to do that. So what we're talking about is overindulgence. And this is I think this is such a powerful topic to talk about in terms of parenting and the impact on our kids. It's an interesting one for me in that the way it originated in terms of my first beginning to work on it and work on the topic as a lecture topic actually came from work that I was doing for, I don't know how many of you know, but for about 30 years, every other summer I worked in either Africa or other third worlds doing projects. And so this one came about because after a couple different times of working in areas where there was very little, people had very little, children had very little, I was so impressed with sort of how centered the kids were, how creative the kids were, how um, gracious and grateful, how much gratitude they lived with. And I just kept kind of eating at me like, what's different about these kids than our kids, and what am I noticing? And so I just started looking up and reading and researching more, and of course other people were probably doing the same thing, so overindulgence started popping up, and then I started in on the topic. So that's how this sort of originated, is that it came from a place of seeing that people who had less were actually in some ways doing much better in some arenas than we were. So what we're talking about is overindulgence. And I want to start with, you have a sheet that you got. And once we talk about what overindulgence is, I'm going to have you pull it out. It just says why parents overindulge. And so I'll give you a chance to sort of peek at that and we'll talk about it. But I want to first talk about what overindulgence is. So overindulgence starts by identifying, first of all, what is too little, what is scarcity. So over having enough, we're going to talk about, but overindulgence is basically scarcity. Then is when you don't get basic needs met. And basic needs are, anybody want to guess what they are? Those of you who are on. So what are the basic needs? Anyone?
I would say basic needs, clothing, food.
Clothing, food.
Shelter.
Shelter, good. Clothing, food, shelter. Any guess what the other two are? There are 5.
Is belonging there?
Close. Love. I would say, yeah, love and belonging. One more. Anybody have an idea? It's kind of surprising. It's fun. Fun is the 5th basic need. So it's
wow.
needs are shelter, food, clothing, love, and fun. And if you don't have enough of those basic needs, you live in scarcity. So most of us in this community, not everyone, because there are people in this community who live in scarcity. They have too little. But most of us do not live in scarcity. We live with enough. So enough is basically just what we said. Enough is having basic needs met. Now, I want to describe though what enough is, because when you live in a community, or when you live in a society or a group where more than enough is the norm, where overabundance is a norm, you live in abundance. If you live in overabundance, we oftentimes don't know what enough is. So enough is, in terms of enough shelter, it's enough to protect you from the elements. So it's not like you have to have 2 bedrooms or a bath, or a bedroom for the kids and a bedroom for the parents. It's like it can just be a roof depending on what the environment is. So it has to protect you from the elements. So one time, one of the kids asked me in a workshop when I was working with them, one of the kids said to me, well, they saw someone downtown in Olympia who was living in a box on the street. And they said, is that enough? And I said, well, it probably would be in the summer, but probably would not be scarcity when it got cold, because it wouldn't be protecting them from the elements. So it's just enough shelter to protect you from the elements. Food, interestingly enough, comes up a lot. It's enough to sustain growth or health. And so if you are full, because some people will say when you have enough food to be full, full is living in abundance. You don't have to be full to be able to sustain health or to grow. So if you have enough food that you can feel full at your meals, you live in abundance. Clothing wise, how much clothing? Anyone have a guess? Clothing is 2 outfits, because one outfit may need to be washed. So it's enough clothing to be able to protect you from the elements again, and to be able to wash it and then have another outfit to wear. So 2 outfits is enough to sustain you. Love is not, of course, definable, but that love and belonging. And then fun is an interesting one. And fun was a surprise to me when I started researching about this, because I think in our culture, and for most of our children, we really believe fun is entertainment. And so if they aren't being entertained, they don't feel like it's enough. Whereas in most of the cultures that I have been working in the summers, doing projects, humanitarian projects, they rarely were entertained, but they had a lot of fun. Sometimes that was taking an old, hubcap with a stick and rolling it up and down hills, but they were having a lot of fun. So fun and entertainment need to be sort of sorted out when we look at enough and in abundance. So then anything over enough, anything over those 2 outfits, anything over, having just enough shelter to protect you from the elements, etc., is living in abundance. So this is huge, because what's so important about overindulgence is that when you don't know what enough is, you basically live your life with a sense of deprivation. And so one of the biggest gifts we can give our kids is to have a really strong sense of what enough is. And we can talk more later about how do we help them get that sense of what enough is when they live, most of them, many of them, in abundance. So that's one thing we want to talk about. Now, entitlement, when we talk about entitlement and kids being entitled, or to be perfectly honest, ourselves, adults being entitled, it's when you have the belief that somehow you deserve to live in abundance. That's entitlement. So it's important to really understand those concepts to help our kids understand those concepts, and then to be able to make decisions and have strategies to help our kids feel healthier about what it means to live with enough or to live in abundance, etc. So anything over enough that they're given is basically a gift. So if we live in abundance, it's a gift too. So it's sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, I thought I would gift you with a cookie when I came home from grocery shopping. It's like the cookie wasn't something they needed to sustain them for food and health, but I wanted them to know that I still wanted to gift them. So I'd say, I brought home a gift of a cookie. So anything over enough is basically a gift. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about scarcity, enough, abundance, overindulgence. We're going to talk about that definition in just a second. So questions about enough and abundance first, and scarcity if we need to. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to turn to the pages. On top of the page, it says definition of overindulgence. So the definition of overindulgence is giving too much of what looks good too soon or too long. Let me say that again. Giving too much of what looks good too soon or too long. So, for example, we could use sugar, sweets, sodas, candy, cookies. It's giving too much of what looks good, but it's not necessarily what we need to sustain us. It's giving children things and experiences that are not appropriate for their age or their interests. And the example I'd use here is that one of my children was invited to a birthday party when they were 10, where they were picked up in a limousine and taken to a gaming place and then brought home. And it was undoubtedly really exciting, don't get me wrong, but a great example of giving kids and children things and experiences that are not necessarily appropriate for their age and interests, and begins to set up some kind of normalization. Does that make sense? That if that is normal to expect at 10, then it would take very little to cross over into deprivation. So overindulgence is giving a disproportionate amount of resources in a way that appears to be meeting children's needs, but does not. So that disproportionate amount of resources is a really good tool for trying to sort of assess when we're overindulging. A good example here is almost inevitably people spend way more on buying their children clothing than they do on their own clothing. So there's a disproportionate amount of that resource going to a child. So in overindulgence, children experience scarcity in the midst of plenty. So when you believe that having your own bedroom or your own bedroom and your own bath is what enough is, if for some reason you had to share a bedroom with a sibling, but you were definitely protected from the elements, then you would consider yourself living in scarcity. So it's why so many of our children have sort of that feeling that they never have enough. So when I go to classes and work on this in grade school, that usually by the time they're in third grade, I'd say second, sometimes third, fourth grade, when I ask kids what enough is, any guesses what the majority of them say? They all have pretty much a similar response. They say it a little differently, but it's kind of the same belief. Anybody have a guess what enough is by the time you're in third grade or so, from a kid's perspective?
When they say they get everything that they want.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what they say, when I have everything I want. And so you can see that if by third grade, that is their internalized definition of what enough is, that basically they have a lifelong experience of living in deprivation, of living with scarcity. Living with scarcity is a miserable life sentence, you guys. So if there's any part of you that feels like it's something you're doing for the sake of your kids, something I really want to point out, that overindulgence is really more hurtful than loving in terms of what you can do for your children. And then the last aspect of overindulgence is it hinders children from doing developmental tasks and learning life lessons. So, what I'm trying to point out here more than anything is we can live healthily and functionally and happily with abundance. I think it's important to recognize abundance. I think it's important to have gratitude for abundance that we live in. But you can live in abundance healthily. It's when it crosses over into overindulgence that it literally becomes harmful to our children, to ourselves, to people. So the fine line there is really trying to live in abundance without crossing over into overindulgence over and over and over again. So now what I want to do is step back for a minute before we specifically talk about this. And I want you to look at the sheet that says why parents overindulge. Before you look at this sheet, I want to talk for a second about this. So oftentimes when the question's asked, or maybe sometimes it's a statement where parents will say, oh, the grandparents are the ones who overindulge my children. We don't overindulge, my grandparents do. When you look at research and look at the statistics, it's interesting who overindulges. So 2-parent families overindulge the most. Single mothers overindulge second most. Single fathers third most. Grandparents are fourth in terms of overindulgence. Now, I think that the reason that people say that is because when they think about overindulgence, they think about material overindulgence only. And when we talk tonight, we're going to talk about overindulgence in a way broader scope, because it's important to understand that it's not just material overindulgence that is going to impact your kids learning life lessons or that sense of living in deprivation, whatever that may be. So we're going to look at it in a much broader sense. And when you look at it in the broader sense, you could say, oh, but grandparents buy them way more gifts than we do, etc. But it's broader than that. And in fact, interestingly enough, it's probably more grandparents than parents who recognize overindulgence and recognize the cost of overindulgence, because they have seen both sides of living with enough, or maybe even living in scarcity, and now see what it looks like to live in abundance, and sometimes cross over into overindulgence for their children and grandchildren. So questions about who overindulges the most. Okay, now why you overindulge. So look at this list of true and false. Just go through it quickly and kind of just sort of look for yourself about, what's true for you about true or false about overindulging. I want to say that, because I don't want to take the time, this is something I want you to do on your own, because I think it's helpful when you know what it is that drives your own need to overindulge. But these are all true for some people, so they aren't all true for everyone, but every one of these are true. Some people overindulge because of guilt. Some people overindulge because they were overindulged. Some people overindulge because they lived in scarcity. Every one of these is true. What's helpful for you on this form is for you to go through and circle the truths for you. Because then if, for example, guilt is yours, it's like then you want to be conscious of that. Am I doing this because it's going to serve my kids, because it's healthy, abundance, or am I doing this out of guilt because I worked a lot this week, so I'm bringing home something to make up for that guilt? There's nothing useful in that. So, or if you, for example, are divorced and you know you're overindulging because you're competing with the other parent about wanting to be loved and favorite, then you want to look at that and go, is that really going to be the outcome that I want out of this? And what's the cost going to be? So it's important to go through this and look for yourselves about why I might overindulge and what overindulgence triggers would be for yourselves. With that said, so you can hang on to this and do that one later for yourselves. With that said, I want to be
I have
really
a
clear.
question though.
Yeah, go ahead, Tina.
On the Why Parents Overindulge sheet, it says media programming. What exactly do you mean by that?
Oh, so sometimes well, it's a good one for now, because basically you're overindulging because you've sort of bought into the media culture of video games and Netflix. And I mean, you could watch TV or be on screens all day long because there's so much available now. And it oftentimes goes with, let's see if I can find the one, I don't know what number it is, where it talks about easier than setting limits. That combination makes it easy to overindulge in that arena because it's just easier if you're tired, for example, to let them be on screens than to fight about it. So it'd be something along those lines. And then media programming in another way, if you were to look at media programming, would be, do you remember growing up, and now our kids are really bombarded, that advertising of the best cereals you could get, that you felt like you were living in deprivation if you didn't have those cereals or you didn't have that toy that there. So media programming is, we could talk about media forever. It's a whole other topic. But definitely media programming is a big one for a lot of people. Okay, anyone else? Now, with that said, one of the things I want to talk about here is that it's really, really important to understand, and hard, I think, as the adult working with children, to really accept that overindulgence is an adult issue. It's a parenting issue. It's not a child issue. And we'll oftentimes want to turn it around, turn the mirror, the table, and say, our kids are just spoiled. They're just spoiled brats. They're just spoiled. Well, they don't come out spoiled. They come out and we overindulge them, and then they begin to become entitled. Their entitlement is about us. It's about our boundaries. It's about our value system. It's about meeting an adult need. Overindulgence is about meeting adult needs. It's not about meeting kids' needs. So I want to say that because I think that it's easy for us to not take that responsibility and make change around this particular parenting issue until we take responsibility that this is really about kids and not children. So questions about that? Okay, so what we're going to do now is, on the same sheet that you have definition of overindulgence, there's a list of ways that we can indulge and how they manifest. And so I kind of want to go through that just because I think when we're immersed in a culture, we live in a culture where basically the culture basically is designed to basically thrive on overindulgence. And so because we're so habituated to the abundance we live in, we can get oblivious to how we become entitled in it, how we cross over into overindulgence and become and create entitlement. So, what we're doing now is we're going back and we're going to go past, doesn't matter. We don't necessarily have to, for example, clothes are on here. We'll talk about it in a minute. I'm not going to say that you have to go back to having one outfit for your two outfits for your kids, one to wash and one to wear. It's like that's not what I'm going to be professing you need to do. But I just want to see if we can get more consciousness so that we're thinking about it more as we do this, so that we're more equipped to think about what are appropriate for age and development, what's going to get in the way of them learning developmental tasks or learning a life lesson. I just want to see if we can move towards health around this. So in terms of food, what are some of the ways we overindulge with food? Please, you guys, just sort of start saying things if you want. I'll add to it. How do we
Junk
overindulge?
food, sweets.
Treats, too many unhealthy treats. Okay.
Eating out all the time.
Say it again. Eating out.
Eating out all the
Yes,
time.
eating out all the time. Absolutely.
Not making them eat their vegetables.
Not making them eat their vegetables. And if you look, it's like, you don't want to fight. It's not worth the time. You're tired. I mean, we can think of all the reasons, but, it's definitely impacting their health and well being. So, too much of what looks good, snacks, that even the piece about I'm hungry, or I'm full, and the idea that they can have food available anytime, that's abundance. It's abundance to be full. And so, even to talk about that. So, when kids will actually get mad, like there wasn't enough of that, we ran out and they're upset. And then we feel guilty and feel like we have to go get them something else. It's like, no, it's like you've had enough and we ran out of that particular food and you're okay, even though you're not necessarily full. So, just that idea of having them recognize that being full is abundance, that sometimes they are not going to be full. Sometimes they are not going to have enough at one particular time of a food that they would like to have, what looks good or tastes good to them. Sort of the short order cook is another way we really overindulge. It's like, what do you want for breakfast? Do you want eggs? Do you want cereal? Do you want yogurt? What do you want? What do you want? Or when we fix 2 or 3 meals because our kids don't want to eat what we have to fix. So then we fix macaroni and cheese for one. We fix hot dogs for another one. So you're short order cooking, basically. All of those are ways that we overindulge. They keep kids from learning life lessons. It keeps them from developing their developmental tasks. It makes them think they live in deprivation unless they have food they like or want all the time. So there's a lot of ways that we overindulge around food. Okay, clothing. How do we overindulge around clothing? Keep referring back to your definition. You guys, sometimes it's helpful to sort of think about the definition, that disproportionate amount of resources or whatever, to help us recognize. How do we overindulge around clothing?
The latest clothes that are in style.
Latest clothes and style.
Name brands.
Name brands. Anything else you can think of?
New rather than used.
Yeah, new rather than used. Disproportionate amount of resources. Like I said, most people spend way more on their children's clothes than they spend on their parents' clothes, and sometimes a disproportionate amount of their own resource. So not only are they spending more on their clothing their clothing, but they're also spending more than their budgets really provide. So more, we're going in debt basically to provide clothing that's unnecessary or overindulgent, inappropriate for age, and things like, buying little girls clothes that would be like teenagers would wear, or so inappropriate for age and development. So there's other ways. Anybody else think of any right now? Those are the ones that come to mind for me. Oh, I know another one. Not taking care of their clothes, getting in the way of their learning developmental or life lessons. One of the things that would drive me crazy when I would go work at the different grade schools, for example, is that I would inevitably, somewhere close to the office, go by this piles, and I mean huge piles of lost, lost clothing that the kids had. And at the end of the year, they would, just take that box and turn it in. But I cannot tell you how many people left jackets in that lost and found all year long, which meant that probably when their kids lost a piece of clothing, it was replaced. So, not, got in the way of learning the life lesson of one, taking better care of your clothing. I used to point out that I would leave clothing that I would take with me, for example, to a village that I was working in Africa. I'd leave a pair of jeans or some clothes there. And if I came back a year later, sometimes 2 years later, those jeans look better than when I left them, because they took care of them, because they knew they weren't going to get new clothing if they wore them out or didn't take care of them. So, how we take care of clothes is, not taking care of clothes is a form of overindulgence. All right. Anyone else around clothing? Okay. How about toys? Anyone?
Always wanting the newest rage in the toy.
Yeah, that's the whole, I mean, that one goes back to when she was talking about media, for one thing, media programming. It also goes back to that piece about our kids really learning that they not recognizing they live in abundance because they don't have the newest toy. And so there's a sense of scarcity and deprivation. So definitely the newest toy, the biggest rage, too many toys, so many toys that they don't take care of what they have. Um, so many,
Or they don't even play with them.
they don't even play with them. Exactly. Or so don't play with them, don't take care of them, lose them. Um, I would say, in terms of creativity, that they are not particularly good at finding out how to entertain without something that entertains them, including that would include a toy that you buy versus something they make for themselves that could be fun. So it impacts creativity. Sometimes inappropriate for age and development, getting toys that are too expensive and or too advanced for their age. So anything else around toys that you can think of? Okay. Handing them down, I think, is another one. It's like we used to hand toys down to cousins, that kind of thing. Doesn't happen much anymore. It's that whole idea of just, getting a new toy, their own toy. All right. How about emotionally? Now, this one is interesting, and this is where I really want to get people to start broadening things a little bit and really looking, because I would say that this is one of those arenas where I think grandparents recognize overindulgence more than we do. So, how do we overindulge our kids emotionally? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Maybe fix it for our children rather than having them figure out how to fix it.
Absolutely. Jumping in too quick to fix things or fix a situation that makes them unhappy.
Trying to make them as happy as soon as possible instead of living in the emotion to process.
Yeah. So one would be fixing it instead of helping them learn the life lessons and developmental task of learning how to manage an emotion. Absolutely. There's a big one that goes with both of those. What has happened in the last generation or two? Why do grandparents recognize this and we're so much more likely to be overindulgent emotionally? Anybody know?
Is it the idea of always entertaining your kids and not just letting them play and figure it out themselves?
Yeah, it's all related to that. It's that idea that there was a big switch. It's almost been 2 generations now where we went from where kids were to be seen and not heard, basically, in a system that they were not the hub of the system, to where we start switching over to what we call child-focused parenting and child-focused families, where our kids were the focus of the family, what our kids needed, if they were happy emotionally, was more important than any other part of the system. And so that was a huge switch. And there was a lot of positive things that came out of that, in the sense that it was valued for kids to have a voice and be heard. We were much more humanitarian in our approach to teaching. There's a lot of positive things that came out of child-focused parenting. But one of the negatives that came out of child-focused parenting, if you were here when we talked about emotional intelligence last time, was that in order to be most emotionally intelligent, you have to be able to be okay having your whole range of emotions and knowing how to manage the whole range of emotions in yourself and how to manage the whole range of emotions in other people. And as we became more child focused, what happened is that we became very focused on being and trying very hard to be sure our kids never had uncomfortable emotions. We wanted them to be happy, secure, valued, accepted, prioritized all the time. And so if they were sad, or if they were disappointed, or if they were overwhelmed or frustrated, as I don't remember which one of you, Lisa or Tana, or Sarah, who said, we fixed it for them, or we jumped in too soon, or we didn't want them to have any of those uncomfortable emotions. And one of the big, big costs of child-focused parenting is that we really undermined their emotional intelligence and learning those life lessons and learning how to manage emotions in themselves and others and even have them. So, it isn't unusual at all for our kids to be really angry that we aren't fixing when they have an uncomfortable emotion. Like, they're disappointed that we aren't doing something to make that disappointment go away immediately, if not make it go away, period. And so just reminding you that, it's a disproportionate amount of energy we're spending in the family. And one of the other big costs of that are systemic costs, in that by child focusing, parents aren't taking care of themselves the way they should because they're giving time and energy to all their kids' activities. parents aren't getting downtime. Sometimes parents aren't getting enough sleep because they're having to work more and longer to pay for the things they want for their children. We're looking at children not participating, which we'll talk about chores here in a few minutes and things. But systemically, it's a disproportionate amount of resources, a disproportionate amount of energy is going to children versus other people in the system. So emotionally, there's a lot of the overindulgence that's happening in this generation that is causing problems for our children. Okay, anyone else about emotionally? Okay, spatially. So space-wise, we overindulge by basically providing more space, sometimes more than is we can disproportionate amount of resources. We have houses that are bigger than we can afford, cars that are bigger or fancier than we can afford, and so what happens is, so for example, when we talked about this, what's come up in middle school, by middle school, when we talk about overindulgence, is kids will start to talk about how there are kids who don't bring kids to their house because they just live in a 2 or 3 bedroom house. And it's interesting because a few years back, if it wasn't 2-story, that made a big difference. If they'd say, well, I only live in a single-story house, so I'm embarrassed to bring people to my house because it's not as fancy as other people's houses that have 2 stories, or I don't have my own bedroom, or I don't have my own bathroom. And so spatially, our kids are incredibly, a lot of them live in incredible abundance. And because, Tana, what were you going to say something? Go ahead.
I'm switching from my computer to my phone, so it was going back and forth. But I have to drive to go pick up Rael, so
Okay.
Sorry.
All right, go ahead. All right, I thought you needed me. All right. And so basically, spatially, our kids think they live in deprivation if they don't have at least abundance, and what I would probably say is overindulgence. And so it's costing them in terms of their self-esteem if they don't recognize they live in abundance. It's definitely costing us in terms of resources and disproportionate amount of resources to maintain the spatial needs that they seem to believe that they need, or they live in scarcity. And it's interesting, this one crossed over a few years ago when I was doing this with a class, an older class. We talked about it, and we talked about disproportionate amount of resources, and that when we look at overindulgence, if we were to look at it in a broader picture, like globally, that we tend to be overindulgent, for example, in the US, and that our footprint is so much greater, in terms of the overall proportion of resources that we take globally to sort of maintain the lifestyle that we've become accustomed to. And so I was just talking about overindulgence globally. And interestingly enough, one of the children went home and they were talking about overindulgence, and which is great. And I love that the kids were doing that, and they had a conversation. And then a father called and was saying that he was really upset because his child felt guilty because we had this conversation about overindulgence and talking about the footprint globally, and that it made his child feel guilty, and he was really upset about that. Which is ironic because what we just talked about in terms of emotionally, that it's like that his first concern and first thought wasn't any learning that may have come out of that around spatial, but more about the emotional and how it causes child to have an uncomfortable emotion. So you can see how these all sort of tie together and how we sort of perpetuate our overindulgence unintentionally. So spatially, media wise, we could all talk about that. And I think this one, interestingly enough, sort of has reared its ugly head in terms of what happens with overindulgence, because it has become such a challenging thing for parents in terms of managing screens and screen time, and what it costs in terms of their rapport with their children, what it costs in terms of their children's well-beings, in terms of managing their emotions, in terms of their health, getting enough exercise, in terms of them being custodians of the earth because they're never outside to have a connection to it. So now, interestingly enough, when we first started talking about overindulgence, media was something we would talk about, ways we overindulge, screen time, too much TV. But as we had more and more access and technology, I think it became clear for parents, without even having to talk about it, what the cost of overindulgence is in that arena. How about entertainment? So let's talk about entertainment. How do we overindulge in entertainment? Anybody have any idea?
Maybe going out and buying the newest video game.
Yeah, it's definitely provision. For one thing, we buy all these toys and video games and things for them to do. Any other ideas, you guys, how we overindulge entertainment wise?
Always having scheduled play dates and outings.
I was waiting for someone to come up. Scheduling play dates and having scheduled play dates and scheduling their play dates. It was interesting to me how many people, how much that was just sort of an accepted thing. And then I had a friend here from the UK, and she was like, why are you arranging these play dates for your kids? And her point being that they could arrange their own play dates, or they could go down and find a neighbor to play with, or so play dates and arranging their play dates, entertaining them, just period. It's like probably one of the biggest complaints I'll get from parents is this idea that their kids always have to have someone doing something with them because they can't entertain themselves. So disproportionate amount of our time is spent entertaining our kids by playing with them, so they aren't learning developmental tasks, life lessons that they need to learn. So playing with them, playing for them is one of the first things in infant class I start to work on, is how quickly, and we'll laugh about it, how parents will actually play with the toy for their kids, and then their kids will bring the toy for them to play with it for them because they aren't able to make it spin at first on their own, which is the whole idea, is they're supposed to be able to struggle with that to learn how to spin it. So just that idea again of going back emotionally, where we didn't want to see our kids struggle, so we don't want them to feel bored, so we play with them. We don't want them to struggle learning how to play or find something to entertain themselves, so we find stuff to entertain them, on and on and on. And maybe guilt comes in there because many of us are two parents working or single parents working, so we're feeling guilty that we're not playing enough with our kids, that kind of thing. And so, you could go on and on, but entertainment. So anybody else around entertainment? Okay, pets. How do we overindulge with pets? Too many, number one. More than for a lot of people, then they can. It's a disproportionate amount of their resources they're spending. So maybe too much, too many. It can be not taking care of them. I think it's helpful when you think about developmental tasks that really age 11 is when we know kids have the brain development and capacity to actually take care of a pet. And so most of the pets before age 11, we're taking care of them. We're generally the ones who are feeding or so on. Again, they're costly. Vet bills, um, time and energy that it takes to play with them. And so I can't tell you how many people have talked about how a child has convinced them to get a dog. They say they're going to walk their dog, but they don't walk their dog. Or they're refused to pick up after they go to the bathroom in the yard, that kind of thing. And so we overindulge with pets. And so really stopping to think, like, what do we get pets for? What do we expect to be the life lessons learned from a pet? How do we set boundaries to be sure that happens? So on. Holidays. How do we overindulge around holidays? I'm just going to go through some of these because we're going to run out of time, you guys. Holiday wise, it's like it used to be that there would be big stuff at Christmas, maybe some stuff at Easter. Now there's rows of stuff at the grocery store for St. Patrick's Day. There's all kinds of stuff for Thanksgiving. It's like every holiday is huge, and every holiday can have stuff that goes with it, gifts that go with it, or clothing that they get to wear, or. So holidays are generally not considered necessarily just families getting together anymore and sharing food, for example. They're much greater than that in terms of they become so material driven. And every holiday, because it is material driven. So holidays is another way we overindulge. Cars is an interesting one. So I'm thinking of cars and children at this point. We could also talk about cars and our own entitlement and overindulgence around cars as adults. But I'm just going to use an example since we're talking about it in terms of parenting right now. So I have 4 children. My children are spaced. My first 2 are really close together. And then there's 8 years. And then there's another 8 or 9 years between the last one. So I have this big spacing. So it's really easy for me to see. So with my older kids, when they turned 16, they had to drive the family car. They drove the family car, and that was a privilege just to be able to take the family car. And then they had to earn money. They had to buy their own car. We would contribute, but they saved money to buy, and generally an older, kind of clunkier used car. And then they had to work and pay for their own gas. Then when my second one, it's actually third, so that's the first 2. When the third came, then it was that he too had to buy his own car, and his peers, but they were starting to, about half of his peers, his parents were buying them cars when they turned 16. And then when, and definitely they were starting to all pay for their gas. And so we could see the change. With Alex, it's like everybody expected to get a car at 16. A lot of them expected to get a new car at 16. And I'm going to give you an example of deprivation here in a minute. A new car at 16, and their insurance and their gas were provided as well by their parents. So in those 20 years difference, say less than 20 years difference, I could see how we kept moving from abundance, because even having a car in most countries is abundance. But having a car, that a kid could use, and then having a kid have their own car, and then, buying their car and paying for their gas and insurance and so on. So we could just see how abundance kept creeping over into overindulgence and learning life lessons and developmental tasks. So the story I want to tell about this in terms of how it impacts kids and makes them feel like they live in scarcity or with deprivation. So I had a dad call me early one morning, probably about 10 years ago, and was really upset, said his daughter was just hysterical and they couldn't calm her down, and could they please come in an emergency session before school. So I said absolutely. So they brought her in, and her crisis was that it was her birthday, and they told her they were buying her a car for her birthday. And what they did was they bought her a used Honda, nice car, by the way, a used Honda. But in her head, she really believed they were going to buy her a new car. And so her hysteria was that she had a shit car for her birthday. She got a shit car, and that she was going to have to go to school and with the humiliation of this shit car. And it's like maybe you can laugh about that now, but if any of you have looked at the parking lot in the high schools and look at the parking lot in the state parking lots, it's like there's much nicer cars in the high school parking lots than there are in the state parking lots. And so it becomes a sense of this girl was genuinely feeling deprivation, scarcity, in obviously the midst of plenty. She had incredible abundance, but her scarcity was real and intense for her. And I just want people to get that is real for kids. That when we create overindulgence as the norm and they become entitled to it, their sense of deprivation and the impact it has on them is very real. This is not a brat. This is just someone who experiences what it feels like to be entitled and live with that sense of deprivation in the midst of plenty. So, questions about cars before we move on. Okay, vacations. So, for many people, when we were growing up, vacations, sometimes people didn't ever have vacations. I mean, I have friends, for example, who said their families never went on anything like a vacation. Their fathers didn't take a vacation, etc. Or if vacations sometimes would be camping, they would go camping, or a road trip, a simple road trip or whatever. As time has gone on, vacations have gotten bigger and bigger. And kids now expect a vacation to not, camping isn't a vacation. A vacation would be going to Hawaii. A vacation would be going to Disneyland. A vacation would be going to Europe. It's just the expectation. So as a result of that, for example, one of the manifestations is that they actually now in later grade school, one of the things they used to do when kids first came back to school, you might even remember it when you were a kid, is they would say, write about your summer vacation. And they had to stop doing it because it was so divisive in the classes because some of the kids still didn't have a summer vacation. They were off from school, but they didn't go on anywhere on a trip. And other kids were going to Europe or some big excursion. And kids were beginning to lie about their vacations because they were embarrassed that they didn't have vacations that compared to some of the other kids. So they just had to literally, one teacher saying, we just stopped doing it. We don't do it anymore because of that. So you can see how we just keep moving over and what overindulgence looks like around vacations. Chores. So the way we overindulge with chores, and this is a systemic issue. So this one really crosses over into learning, life experience, and developmental tasks. And one of the things in child-focused parenting that has been a cost is that our kids have much less honed systemic skills. And systemic skills are things like cooperation, following directions, learning how to ask for assistance. It's learning how to keep a home running or a system running as a group. It's learning how to communicate with people in a group. There are all kinds of things that you learn, and the first place you learn systemic skills is generally in a family. And so as we became more child focused, we got further and further away from children learning systemic skills. So we would say, well, they have sports after school, or they have activities after school, and then they have homework, and then they need to have their screen time, so that they really don't do any chores or do any cooking or do any cleaning. And so basically all those systemic skills, just one, basically knowing how to do things like really clean a bathroom or mop a floor or really vacuum or cook a meal or put a meal together or wash clothes or fold clothes, all of those basic things. They aren't learning those skills. They aren't learning how to work as a system for everyone to get needs met and get a home taken care of, for example. So their systemic skills have really faltered. And it's interesting because it's really showing up in terms of work. I've got a lot of employers who are calling and wanting to talk about how hard it is with their employees who have been raised with this child-focused parenting, who don't have good systemic skills. We're seeing it with kids who launch and don't know how to really take care of themselves or live with other people and maintain together a system, a dorm room, an apartment, etc. And so this whole idea of, again, not wanting our kids to be overwhelmed and wanting them to be sure that they had a nice childhood, they aren't learning and doing chores or doing systemic kinds of activities that are so incredibly important for their development. So questions about chores. So just FYI, developmentally, by the time your kids are 10, they should be able to do any major activity in the house: vacuum, clean a bathroom, do dishes, any of the maintenance things I have. There shouldn't be anything they aren't capable of doing with complete competence by the age of 10. By the age of 10, ideally, in living in a system, they would be doing, if there were 2 parents and 2 children, they'd be doing a quarter of the chores on a daily basis to maintain a home. So it just gives you an idea of how far most of our kids are from that. And they'll say things like, they'll come home when their parents ask, and they'll say, well, none of my friends do chores, or my friends don't have to do, dishes, and they aren't wrong about that. I mean, part of what happens with overindulgence and what's so hard is it's hard to really work on overindulgence by yourself, because our children are in their own sort of cultures, their school cultures, their neighborhood cultures, their family cultures. And so if other kids are normalizing entitlement and overindulgence, it's hard for us to work on it. So overindulgence is always easier to do in a group. It's always much easier to do if you can get together with other parents and say, let's all be sure they're doing some chores. Let's all be sure that they have to get their own transportation. Let's all be sure that, so it becomes harder and harder to turn around overindulgence, to turn around entitlement by yourself. And as it escalates, even harder. All right. So questions about chores.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have an only, and she's 14.
Mm-hmm.
We've had the chore chart, and it's gone okay for a while, and then it just kind of fell off. So just kind of some advice around, obviously she's old enough to do
Right.
the
Probably-
majority of things around the house. And we always kind of go by, if we ask you to do something, you know, there shouldn't be any hesitation. There shouldn't be anything, you just do, which is basically, you know, laundry, dishes, taking out the garbage, that sort of thing.
Exactly right, Sarah. So I really am not one who professes that you should have chore charts, because it's not really learning a life lesson. One of the life lessons is about learning and maintaining in a family and a home is being able to recognize that the bathroom doesn't always need cleaning on Wednesday. It might need cleaning on Tuesday, or maybe it's going to need cleaning on Friday. And so I also realistically, if you remember about the brain development, when we talk about middle school and brain development during that time, I wouldn't necessarily expect that she's going to be able to look around and assess what needs to be done on a daily basis, on a really regular basis. I mean, she may by this point start to recognize when it's time to unload a dishwasher or load up a dishwasher or sweep a floor or something. But it's okay, for example, that you're saying to her, what I usually would do with the kids at that age is I would just take a Post-it, and before they came home from school, I just would write on a Post-it, Chris, fold the load of clothes and feed the cat. Alex, vacuum the living room and, go out and get the mail. And then they would just that would be their chores for the day. So it's like I expect kids to participate. I don't necessarily expect, sometimes people will say, well, I don't expect to have to tell them. They should just be able to recognize and do it. That's because they do live in abundance, you guys. It's true that many of you, and especially if you came from a more rural farm sort of setting, it's like you recognize what had to be done. Nobody told you what you had to do. You knew you had to keep something going, so you would do it. But our kids do live in abundance, and they do not necessarily haven't developed those life skills yet. But we can still have abundance and have them learn systemic skills and learn how to do the chores so that they are capable when they launch. So I think you're on the right track, Sarah. And the only thing I would add to that is they get to have emotions. They just can't violate with those emotions. So you could say to her, for example, you need to empty that dishwasher before you go to bed, something like that. And she might huff. I've got to get to bed. I've got a test tomorrow. It's like you don't have to be mad at her for huffing. She can huff, but she can't start calling you names or telling you that you guys are abusive or whatever else some of the kids are doing. It's like she can huff, but she still empties the dishwasher. And you don't have to say anything. Just walk out of the room and she huffs through the dishwasher. And that's all there is to it. So she doesn't have to be happy. I mean, we do a lot of huffing ourselves about things we don't feel like we want to do, believe me. But they still have to do it. So it's just that thing of being sure that she's continuing to participate in doing her share to maintain a home. And she's not going to regret it. I mean, one of the things that has become really clear to me, you guys, about this is that the things that I have been good about, and believe me, I have not been good about other things. But in terms of the things I haven't overindulged about or tried to really not overindulge so my kids would learn life lessons, there's a lot of complaining in the process. But as they've launched, they have come back, every one of them, about one thing or another and thanked me because they've seen how much more of a struggle it is for their friends or a peer who didn't get some of those life skills. So even though they may not be happy as you're working on some of this now, you guys, it's like it really, I think you're going to see that they're going to be grateful for the life skills they've developed by not overindulging them. Did that answer for you, Sarah?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Time. Again, it's kind of one of these that I think we don't think about a whole lot, but it's really important. And that is that, and it falls under the overindulgence of giving a disproportionate amount of resources. There's 24 hours in a day, and our children, as a rule, get way more of our time than we give ourselves. It's like we are running them here, we're running them there, we're picking up friends, we're bringing back friends, we're doing errands for them, picking up supplies, whatever it might be. We do a lot of stuff for our kids and take up a lot of time, and that we really don't give ourselves. So parents are by far very bankrupt. And as we become more fear oriented, and it used to be that after school, or if it was on a weekend or in the summer, our kids would sort of go all over the neighborhood, and everybody was kind of taking care of kids. And so there would be times that were sort of down times where mom might lay on the couch and take a nap when her kids were playing down the street, or who knows what it would be. We don't have that anymore because we pretty much have our kids 24/7 because of the fears we have around that, which we could have a whole nother topic about that. But because of fear, we kind of have them 24/7. And then as we get more fearful, and the other thing we've learned about is as there's more division in terms of economic division, in terms of income, that we get more fearful about our kids having to compete in order to be successful or have a good life. So we take them to more things. They have more after school activities, they have more dance, they have more sports, and they have more, because we're competitive in ways that countries who have a more equal income in their countries don't compete. So we just spend a whole lot more time, disproportionate amount of our resources, our time, on our kids. And they do feel a real entitlement around it. And even with my kids who are launched, I find it super interesting. Just, I was talking about this with a friend because she's noticed the same thing, that they will text me, and if I don't text them right back, they're kind of on me. They're like, "Where are you? What are you doing?" Or if they call, they'll be like, "Where are you? How come you didn't answer the phone?" And all of us we laugh about it, but it's part of our overindulgence, is that we were very available to our children. And we were so available that if we're not still available, even as they've launched, they're a little bit pissy about it because they think that's a bit of deprivation. So just being conscious of really being clear with your kids about it's okay for you to choose not to pick them up one night. Will you pick us out from the mall? It's like, no, I just want to put my feet up and read a book tonight. I don't want to do any running. They might be pissy about it, but what you're helping them learn is that there is a disproportionate amount of time that they may be expecting of yours that doesn't exist. So, questions about time. Okay, how about sports? How do we overindulge around sports?
I've started to realize with sports, like I said, we have an only, and she plays competitive fast pitch. And also with the, I don't know if you would say stigma or kind of whatever you would call it around having an only, but always the phrase has always been, just keep them busy, then they won't get in
Yes.
trouble, or it'll make them a good kid and it'll turn them into a good person. And like I said, I can't speak beyond just having one, but with the one, with being in a competitive sport, can be just as busy and not tending to home or yourself or mental health, however that looks.
Yeah.
A marriage with a partner, just
Right. Imagine Sarah having 3 or 4 kids.
and that's when my husband and I we have quite a few players that are on the team, and they have families that are of 3 children or more, and they all play sports. We've always offered we can help and pitch in, because we've always thought it takes a village. But I literally, it is phenomenal what those families can do with that many kids, and they're all playing a competitive sport to keep them busy, but somewhere down the line, even with one, something has to lack.
Right, exactly. And it's expensive now. It's one thing if they're in competitive sports at school, probably not quite as expensive, but when they're more in the more elite programs, it's incredibly expensive, plus travel. Plus, now you go back and you look at time, how much, of your time is taken doing that. And so, it is a lot of things around sports that we can look at in terms of overindulging. I know with one of my sons that, he would do a sport generally each season. And at one point I just said, okay, you have to pick 2 sports for the year. And eventually it was 1 sport for the year. But I said, and he said he really wanted to do this. And I said, well, okay, but you have to do your own transportation. You either have to get a ride or ride your bike to practice or whatever. And it was interesting to me because once I said he had to provide his own transportation, he opted not to do that sport, which helped me realize then from my next kids down that one of the life lessons they weren't learning was how to figure out how to prioritize what they really liked and didn't like. Is that he had to finally, by seeing that it wasn't going to be as easy, he had to decide if he really liked that sport enough that he would bother to ride his bike to practice and back. And obviously he didn't. So one of the life lessons is if we're not doing too much around some of these activities and sports, it helps them learn what they're really passionate about and what they prioritize. So there are life lessons that are hard sometimes for us to see when we see our kids struggle. And that goes back to the emotional component here that we talked about earlier, where I want people to really understand that struggle is how we get to a lot of these life lessons and developmental tasks that our kids are going to need.
Well, I have a comment on that though. Um, so my son, we want to support him with wrestling because that is an area that he excels in. And so we have played for club wrestling, but that has been a huge time, money, energy suck. And because we've been so devoted to that, then for my daughter, if she has shown interest in something, which it happens to be dancing, then we feel like it's unfair to not allow the same kind of commitment. But now we have 2, both in something that is a large time suck energy thing. And it has just created a lot of other problems because of it. But neither one of them have a college fund. So in my mind, it's like that is his best way to hopefully get college paid for, or at least partially. So that's always weighing on me.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's like, again, what you're talking about, Tana, is like, yes, you're talking about living in abundance in all ways. It's like, even without the college fund, the fact you can go to college and have help getting there, it's like that's abundance. But it's like, it's not that I don't want you to provide abundance. It's that I want you to be able to talk about it as abundance. And I want you to be able to be clear with your kids that this is where it crosses over from just be over, doesn't cross over into overindulgence. When you can say, you know, we are spending this money for you because you love this sport. The cost is that it costs a lot to do that. And in order to do that and support you in that, you have to be okay with not necessarily having as much support at college. Or if you two are going to have your two expensive activities that we're going to try to support and fund, understand that you may not, because we're prioritizing differently in our family, we may not have a fancy car. We may opt not to be going on some fancy vacation because our money is going towards you guys having these activities. So what you're helping them understand is even if you live in abundance, you still have to learn to prioritize. And so as long as you're talking about that, Tana, and talking about how you guys are prioritizing, and so they understand that, then I think you are staying in abundance but not overindulgence. Does that make sense?
Yes, and we are having those conversations, but I've always had a fear of when I was growing up that there was a real fear of money and basically having to worry about the basic needs, that people are saying, oh, well, you don't want your kids to worry about money. You don't want them to have to think about money. It's like, yes, but it is a reality. And it's not like our home is being threatened yet.
Exactly.
We do have to make choices at this point. They can't just have everything they want. And we absolutely have to prioritize.
Right, exactly. And I don't want children worrying about money. Generally, children who worry about money who live in abundance, which, you know, your children are living in abundance, is like they worry because their parents came from a place of worry. Like you said, you worried because you really didn't have enough. You had scarcity at times. So your worry is sort of built in. And so I don't want kids to have that. But if they live in abundance, that's important for them to know they live in abundance, and that abundance is a result of having to prioritize. And so, you know, just keep playing with this. It's like this idea, you guys, and I want to be so clear about this. I don't expect you to go back to enough. I don't want your kids to suddenly have these big lifestyle changes. I just want them to really understand what they have and have some sense of gratitude and peace. There's peace in knowing you have enough. There's peace in knowing that you live in abundance versus that you live in deprivation or live in the midst of plenty, you know. So I want them to have that peace. I want them to have life skills, to have happy lives. And that may be living in abundance, but it doesn't have to be the overindulgence, which is not a happy lifestyle. And so, you know, just quickly, a lot of these things, money and allowance, I want to talk about. I want to be sure we save time to talk about some of the things we can do. Money and allowance, for example, allowance is not something they're entitled to. And a lot of kids who live in abundance just assume that you just get an allowance. All kids should get an allowance. Not all kids should get an allowance. It's like, you know, that isn't necessarily something children are entitled to. And a lot of the kids who get allowance think they just get money for being kids. And allowance, the whole idea of allowance is to use it as a teaching tool. And so if you give your kids $1 a week when they're 6, you would say to them, you now get $1 a week, but we aren't buying stuff at a grocery store when we go anymore. So if there's something you want, if you want gum, it's got to come out of your allowance. Or if you want that $4 thing that you saw at the store, then you're going to have to save 4 weeks to get your allowance. So you don't just give them money to have money, you give them money and you're basically transferring it. So there are people, for example, who are giving their kids in high school $500 a month. And people are like, oh my God, that is really overindulgence. But it is if they're just giving it to them. But many of those parents who are doing that have really just shifted what they're doing. They're saying now you pay your own, you're going to pay your own car insurance. You need to pay your own entertainment. We're not buying your fast food anymore. You're paying your own gas, and that's your clothing allowance. So they're basically living on $500 a month. They're not paying room and board, but they're paying everything else, and their parents are just helping them learn how to basically use that money and budget that money to get through their month. So, but there's no obligation to. And some people just say, by the time they need that kind of money, I expect them to work. That's fine. You have different priorities in terms of how you're teaching. So it's really stepping back and trying to really see if you're really thinking intentionally about what you're providing your kids and expecting of your kids and so on. Not necessarily if you're all doing it the same way or choosing to do it all the same way. So how do you get there? I mean, this is, I think, the important piece is to figure out how to get to a place where your kids really accept and understand enough and living in abundance. And one of the things is that because we live in abundance, we have the opportunity to give them experiences where they can really experience what enough is. So one of the things that in my family was that we had working vacations with our children. So I volunteered anyway, did volunteer work in summers, and third worlds did humanitarian projects. And when they were old enough, starting different ages, Alex, the youngest, started at 5. The older kids were a little older. Chris was 11 when he started. And they did learning vacations. So we lived in a village, and sometimes they lived in a hut, and sometimes they hauled water with the other kids to have water for dinner, and sometimes they shelled peas with the other kids who were shelling peas. And they also have lifelong friends. I mean, it was their way of learning that, that Alex's friend Sarah lived in a one-room house with 4 girls, the mom and dad, and a grandma. And they all just pulled out their beds at the end of the day and slept in one big room. But they were a really happy family. And so what they learned was what enough was. There was enough in that family, and they were wonderful and happy. And so you can provide them experiences that help them recognize enough. And that can come from volunteering locally. That can come from them participating and contributing to some project or whatever it might be. So it isn't just about setting boundaries. And yes, I do expect you guys to start being more intentional and thinking about if we're crossing over into abundance, and do our kids understand when we're gifting them? And are we helping them learn to prioritize and live in systems? I do want that kind of intention. I also want to say that one of the things that happens after I'll do a talk on overindulgence is that parents will get all fired up and go home and feel like they're just suddenly going to change the whole system. And it can't work that way. It's like, this pick 1 or 2 things that you're going to do differently, that you're conscious of now, and do it until it's really integrated and sustained. And then maybe pick something else out and start working on that and integrate it and get it sustained. If you try to just change everything all at once and get all righteous about this topic, it's likely you're not going to be able to really sustain it, because we do live in a culture that thrives on overindulgence. So, it's talking to other parents, is having other people maybe talk about choosing to do some of the same things, sharing rides to games, or talking about what it looks like to provide a car, or working together with other parents. It's picking out some of the things you can do differently. It's starting to talk about enough. It's starting to talk about abundance. It's just even getting those concepts across to your kids would be an incredible growth. So I really want people to be careful to not sort of jump on the bandwagon and then just blow it all out because you can't sustain it. So questions about that? Or comments, you can comment. Okay, so I wanted to just squeeze one little more thing in here tonight. I know that we've talked about a lot and it's overwhelming. But part of overindulgence is learning how to delay gratification, is to stop and pull back and help our kids learn how to delay gratification. When we live in abundance, it's much harder for us to work on overindulgence, much harder for our kids to learn to delay gratification, because they know and we know that we have the ability sometimes to provide things without a delay of gratification. And they certainly see that and sometimes kind of assume that. So, one of the things about delaying gratification is being sure that we are modeling delaying gratification. It's interesting to me because it looks like that sometimes, and sometimes people do because that's their priority, but sometimes people, it looks to kids like people just decide they're going to buy a new car and go out and buy a nice new SUV and come home. And they're like, it just looks like you can just buy a nice car. And what they don't see is that you may have been saving for that car. What they don't see is that you may have adjusted your budget in some other way in order to pay a car payment. So, what I want is to be sure that you're modeling at times delaying gratification. Some people, for example, will have a rule at their house that they'll call it the 3-day rule, that they see something they want, they have to go home and think about it for 3 days. If they really want that, they go back and buy it. And then they'll teach their kids that same thing, even if they have their own allowance. It's like, if you really like that, I'll take you back in 3 days and you can spend your money on it. And so that's one way of learning how to delay gratification. You can set goals within their capability that, you can say, yes, within 6 weeks, you could have enough money to buy that cute stuffed animal that you saw at the toy store. And so, and you can then say, let's put it away. Let's put it, how do you save? You could give them a way to save, a place to save. They could start an account even. And so you just incrementally, sometimes it can be a project. You could say, okay, you want a tree house. Let's do a tree house. But what we have is enough money to get the basic structure on it first, just the whatever you call it, the form, and then by this summer we can save enough money that we can put a floor on it. So you'll basically have the basic structure and a floor, and then by the next year we should have enough money to save that we can actually put a roof on it and put some windows in it. And so you basically are helping them see that incrementally you can accomplish getting something that takes a lot of time, energy, or money. So having projects, celebrating milestones. So once you got that basic structure up, to actually have a celebration, it's like, whoa, look how, we've got this. Now we've got a floor. Woohoo, now we've got. So celebrating the milestones as you get there, really supporting those long-term projects. I mean, I sometimes know I totally undermined my kids because I didn't think I thought they were going to get their feelings hurt or be disappointed because they had set a goal for themselves. And I didn't want them to be hurt or rejected. And luckily, there were times they didn't let me talk them out of things. And I remember one time Alexandra was 5 and she had these empty postcards that she drew pictures on. And she just said one morning that she really wanted this stuffed animal at Ralph's and that she was going to sell postcards and out at the road to buy them. And she was selling them for $0.25, I think. And I tried to talk her out of it. I was like, that's a lot of postcards. A lot of people aren't going to stop and buy your picture. And I feel really badly, but she ignored me, went out with her little table, and came in about an hour later and said she needed to go grab some blank postcards because she sold all the ones that she'd already drawn on. So she was drawing them as fast as she was selling them, and ended up at the end of the day with 50 cents short of her little stuffed animal she was saving for. So I ended up giving her that 50 cents and we bought the animal. But that's where I actually got in her way of delaying gratification and being creative, is that I didn't want, here's the emotional overindulgence again, I didn't want her to feel rejected or disappointed. I learned a good life lesson that day, and she persisted. So sometimes it's just getting out of our kids' way in terms of them learning to delay gratification. But I think it's really, really important arena in every way. It's an important arena for them to delay gratification emotionally, to delay gratification sexually, to delay gratification materially. So it's something that we can start to work on really concretely, that both feeds into overabundance but not overindulging, and gives our kids some really important life lessons. So questions about delaying gratification. Okay. Anything else tonight, you guys? Anything you want to talk about, ask questions about? Do you have anything, Sarah? Nothing in the chat room or anything?
No, there's nothing in there
Okay.
from what I can see. Yeah, I don't have anything else. It was a really good class. Lots of learning.
Good. All right, you guys. That was great having the class tonight. Thanks for the input.
Thanks for everybody for coming and having mics on and giving when you wanted. It was a good one.
Thank you. And sorry for my
Thank you so much.
having to unplug and go back.
No problem at all.
That's
All right.
doing all of it at once.
Yeah. All right. Good night.
Everybody
Bye.
take care.
Thanks. Bye.